It's roughly 200,000 years ago. You're standing somewhere in East Africa. No cities, no countries, no concept of race, just a regular Homo sapiens hoping nothing with bigger teeth than you shows up before dinner. And if you could somehow photograph yourself and show that picture to anyone alive today, one thing would immediately stand out. You probably wouldn't look like what most people picture when they think of human diversity. Because the first modern humans almost certainly had dark skin, which raises a surprisingly interesting question. If we all started from the same place with roughly the same complexion, where did every other skin color come from? And why, when you look at the actual science, does almost every answer turn out to be the opposite of what you'd expect? Let's start with why dark skin existed in the first place, because the real reason is more specific than most people realize. The simple version you've probably heard is that melanin blocks UV radiation, which is true. Melanin is the pigment that gives skin its color, and in a high UV environment like equatorial Africa, having a lot of it is a massive biological advantage. But most explanations stop at it prevents sunburn, and that's actually the less important part. The deeper mechanism researchers point to is folate. Folate is a B vitamin that lives in the blood vessels just under your skin, and UV radiation destroys it. That matters enormously because folate deficiency is directly linked to severe birth defects and male infertility. So dark skin, loaded with eumelanin, may have evolved less to prevent sunburn and more to protect reproduction itself, to keep folate intact long enough for the next generation to actually exist. Evolution doesn't care if you're comfortable. It cares if you have kids. And for hundreds of thousands of years in high UV Africa, dark skin made that far more likely. Then humans started moving, and that's where everything gets strange. Around 60,000 to 80,000 years ago, groups of people began leaving Africa, through the Middle East, into Europe, eastward into Asia, eventually reaching Australia and the Americas. None of them had maps. They just kept walking, generation after generation, following food and water and whatever seemed like a better idea at the time. And as they moved into regions with less sunlight, the evolutionary pressure flipped. In low UV environments like Northern Europe or Siberia, all that melanin that had been protecting folate now had a cost. Less UV getting through meant less vitamin D being produced in the skin, and vitamin D deficiency causes bone disease, immune problems, and a cascade of other issues that are also bad for survival and reproduction. So populations that happened to carry genetic variants for lighter skin suddenly had an advantage. Those variants spread. Over many generations, lighter skin became common in lower UV regions. That's the basic framework. But here's where the actual science starts getting genuinely weird, because almost every specific detail of that story turns out to be more complicated than anyone assumed. Start with the genes themselves. Most people assume light skin is a recent development, something that appeared after humans moved out of Africa and adapted quickly to new environments. Until recently, it was always assumed that humans quickly adapted to have paler skin after entering Europe about 45,000 years ago, but genetic dating has shattered that timeline. 7 genetic variants associated with lighter skin actually developed at least 270,000 years ago, and 4 of them are more than 900,000 years old, hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even existed as a species. Light skin genes aren't a recent invention. They were already sitting in our ancestors' DNA long before we were human, and it goes even further than that. If you think of dark skin as the original human condition, and light skin as something that evolved later, you've actually got it partially backwards. 3 of the genes associated with the darkest skin tones evolved from genes for lighter skin. Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes carry the lighter associated variant at roughly half of the key pigmentation sites. The current thinking is that darker pigmentation was something that appeared after human ancestors lost their body hair. Before that, the skin underneath was largely protected from UV by fur, and lighter skin underneath was the default. Dark skin, in evolutionary terms, came later. It's the adaptation, not the starting point. Now, the story of how lighter skin spread through Europe is one of the most unexpectedly entertaining chapters in genetics research, because the biggest clue came from a fish tank. It took an unintentional tangent of zebrafish cancer genetics research to discover the first major contributor to the skin color difference between Africans and Europeans. Scientists were studying zebrafish to understand cancer, and they noticed a mutant strain that was noticeably lighter in color, a golden variant. They identified a golden gene, SLC24A5, that when mutated leads to more lightly pigmented fish. When they went looking for the same gene in humans, they found it. The human SLC24. A5 gene variants explain about 25% of the skin pigmentation difference between those of European and African ancestry. A quarter of the entire skin color difference between two of the most studied human populations was discovered by accident in a pet store fish, while researchers were looking for something else entirely. As senior author Keith Cheng put it, it's remarkable that this difference in skin color is due to this one nucleotide out of 3 billion. But here's the part that flips the whole migration story on its head. The SLC24A5 variant that swept through Europe isn't exclusively European. It's also common in East Africa, found in a significant portion of some Ethiopian populations, likely carried there by migrants from the Middle East around 30,000 years ago. Some of the genes responsible for lighter skin in Europeans actually have an ancient African origin. Light skin genetics didn't just move out of Africa. Some of them moved back in. And then there's Cheddar Man, who might be the single most disorienting data point in this entire story. Britain's oldest nearly complete human skeleton had dark skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair when he lived in what is now southwest England 10,000 years ago, scientists who read his DNA discovered. As the museum's Chris Stringer put it, it is very surprising that a Brit 10,000 years ago could have that combination of very blue eyes but really dark skin. The combination feels impossible to us now because we associate blue eyes and pale skin with the same population. But pale eyes entered Europe long before pale skin or blonde hair, which didn't come along until after the arrival of farming. The two traits we think of as going together, light eyes and light skin, didn't evolve together at all. They arrived separately, thousands of years apart. Until recently, it was assumed humans quickly adapted to have paler skin after entering Europe about 45,000 years ago, but Cheddar Man shows that's simply wrong. For most of the Ice Age, the people living in Europe had dark skin. What we now think of as European features are extremely recent, so we have dark-skinned Europeans with blue eyes. We have light-skinned genes that originated in Africa. We have ancient DNA that's hundreds of thousands of years older than our species. And then there's the Solomon Islands, which might be the most striking example of all. Residents of the Solomon Islands in the Pacific have some of the darkest skin seen outside of Africa, and they also have the highest occurrence of blonde hair seen in any population outside of Europe. Most people assume that's impossible, that blonde hair and dark skin can't coexist, or that the blondness must have come from European contact. Most experts believed the gene for light hair had been passed on to dark-skinned people by European traders, colonizers, or explorers. But that's not what happened. The gene that causes blonde hair in Solomon Islanders is completely different and independent of the gene that causes blonde hair in Europeans. This mutation doesn't appear in European genomes. An analysis of genomes from 52 human populations around the world revealed. Two completely unrelated populations, on opposite sides of the planet, independently evolved blonde hair from scratch using entirely different genetic mechanisms. Evolution ran the same experiment twice and got the same result through a completely different process. Which brings up something worth pausing on. Africa, the continent most people stereotype as having one skin color, actually contains the most diverse range of skin tones on Earth. Human skin pigmentation is far more genetically diverse across African populations than anywhere else in the world. The full spectrum exists there, side by side, which makes sense when you remember that our species spent the vast majority of its existence entirely on that continent, accumulating genetic diversity that no other region has had time to match. What all of this adds up to is a picture that looks almost nothing like the one most of us carry around. Skin color isn't a fixed biological category. It's a set of responses. Some ancient, some recent, some shared between populations that never met, some different between populations that look identical. The genes involved are older than our species. The traits we associate with specific groups often evolved independently in completely different places. And some of the biggest discoveries in this field came from cancer research in a fish tank. The version of this story where skin color is a simple, stable marker of where your ancestors came from doesn't hold up. What actually happened is messier and more interesting, a species that started in one place, spread across an entire planet, and kept improvising, using whatever genetic tools it already had, or inventing new ones to survive wherever it ended up. If this kind of deep dive into human biology is something you want more of, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And dropping a comment with which part surprised you most genuinely helps figure out what to cover next. The zebrafish one gets people every time.